Well, I've always thought that anthropology should be first and foremost the art of storytelling. So I will begin with a story about how I became an anthropologist. I didn't really plan to, but my parents were both classicists, classic professors of classics, Latin and Greek, at a small college in Maryland. And I grew up hearing stories about the Trojan War and the names of classical Greek heroes, and I absorbed all of that. And really, classics is kind of the anthropology of an ancient culture. And I then went to Swarthmore College, I was very fortunate in being accepted into Swarthmore College. But Swarthmore College didn't have an anthropology department at the time. And by then I thought anthropology would be something I'd really be interested in learning more about. And at the same time, some friends of mine who were also in the college a couple of years ahead of me had decided that they wanted to leave the college, go and live on the land somewhere, sort of back to the land, to build a wilderness cabin, to grow their own food. It was a wild, romantic dream. They were also pacifist anarchists. So they looked around to all the places in North America that might be a suitable location, and they found there wasn't very much wilderness in the U.S. available where you could just move in and build a wilderness cabin. And so they started looking at Canada, and they came upon the Peace River, and they thought, wow, Peace River, we're pacifists. That's good. That's what we should look into the Peace River. And they found some material that had been written to encourage homesteaders prior to World War II, actually, that talked about land that could be homesteaded in the Peace River area and how fertile the soil was and what a great place it was. And they didn't bother to see whether that was still the case. So they loaded up an old Jeep with a trailer and trekked all the way from Pennsylvania to Dawson Creek, British Columbia, where they thought maybe they could find land. And they started talking to people, and they realized, no, it's all privately land. It's by that time, large farms, agribusiness farms, some of them. And they started talking to some of the locals, and some of them said, oh, there's some really nice country up the Alaska Highway, a couple of 100 miles. Dawson Creek is mile 0 on the Alaska Highway. And somebody who'd been up in that area said, the Miniker Valley is really nice. It's just off of mile 210 on the Alaska Highway. So if you drive up to mile 210, hide your vehicle in the bush somewhere. There's a trail that goes down to the Miniker Valley. It's about 7 miles. And maybe you'll find a place where you can build your cabin. So they went there, and it was Crown land. There wasn't any opportunity to officially homestead, but that didn't matter. They were anarchists as well as pacifists. So they figured, we can just be there. We'll just show up. There wasn't anybody else there, they thought, and start building our cabin. So I had talked to them about helping them with this project during the summer. This was 1959. I was 19 years old, sophomore at Swarthmore College. So a friend and I hopped into our little Renault 4CV, little tiny car, and made our way all the way up from Pennsylvania, drove up the Hart Highway, which at the time was a dirt road. It was a new highway from Prince George up to Hudson Hope. It was only been in existence for about 3 or 4 years when we drove up there. And we started to feel like, wow, we are on such an adventure. We're really going into this wilderness area, because most of the buildings along the Hart Highway were log buildings. And it was a different world. It was kind of just the end of a period when these areas were really accessible only by pack horse or by boat, and just recently been opened up to vehicles. And finally, we found our way up to mile 210 on the Alaska Highway. We hid our little car in the bush. There was sort of a clearing there. And then we noticed there was, looks like some people had been there, some people camping there before, and there were blazes on the trees. Somebody taken an axe and chopped the bark off trees and written something on these blazes. And I was so disappointed because I'd come from Pennsylvania, where in the Allegheny Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains there, Boy Scouts from the city would come and sometimes with their axes would deface the trees and leave graffiti. And one of the names on one of the blazes was Chipesa, Chipese. And I thought, that's an Italian name. It's Italian Boy Scout Vandals from New York City. Oh my God, they made it here before me. But there were some other things hanging in the trees. There was some snare wire, some wire that actually was salvaged from the oil exploration seismic activity, and there were some rusty old traps hanging, and so I just didn't know what was going on. And we found the trail. We walked the 7 miles down. Our friends were there. They were well along into building their cabin, and we'd been there a couple of weeks when one day some men and boys on horseback rode into our camp. And my friends already had met them, but I hadn't, and nobody had really told me, you are in fact in Indian country. I had never in my life, coming from Maryland, met what I called a real live Indian. And here they were on horseback, men and boys coming down. And so they were friendly, and they started talking to us, and they asked, well, what are you guys eating? And we were so proud. We had a little hand mill. We were grinding our own grain. We were making bread that you could drive a nail with. And we had tins of Empress jam and peanut butter that we'd laboriously packed down the 7 mile trail. And so they kind of took pity on us, and they sent one of the boys across the river on horseback with a .22 rifle. We heard a little ping of the rifle, and about an hour later, he came back with a deer. And so they expertly butchered the deer, put some ribs up on a stake by the fire, and pretty soon we were having a feast with them. And it really changed my life. Like, I had no idea that a world like this existed. And what I realized later was that they were telling us you are on Indian land, but rather than saying you are on Indian land, you have no business being here, get out, they were saying you are on Indian land and we can tell you that because we can feed you from it. This is the land that we know. We know how to live here. You guys don't. And we'll help you. You seem to be okay. You're kind of innocent, but you're young. But we'll help you. We'll feed you from it. And later, I got the names of the people and found out that they lived at the Prophet River Reserve, which is mile 232 on the Alaska Highway. And I drove up there a couple of times and met some of the elders. And I didn't have a really long, intense contact, but it changed my life. And I found out that they were called themselves DaneZaa, and they were also known in the literature as Beaver Indians. So I went back to Swarthmore and decided I really want to become an anthropologist, but Swarthmore didn't have an anthropology department. So I found out that the University of Pennsylvania, which was just a 30-minute train ride in from Swarthmore, did have an excellent anthropology department. So I took an introductory anthropology course with Ward Goodenough. I'm sure he wouldn't have remembered me. I was just one of a multitude of students. But I did okay. And then I found out that Carlton Kuhn, who was a total character, was teaching a graduate seminar on the cultures of hunting and gathering people. And I talked my way into his course, even though I was an undergraduate at another college with then only an introductory course in anthropology. But he was really interested that I had actually been up with the Beaver Indians, who were hunters and gatherers who had virtually never been studied. The only literature about them was Pliny Earl Goddard in 1910, 11, around there. He was a linguist, Athabascan linguist, and spent some time at Dunvegan, but he hadn't actually spent any time in the Fort St. John area. So no anthropologist, no one had ever really documented the lives of the people I'd met. So Kuhn thought that was really cool and asked me to do a paper about the Beaver Indians. And I read all the literature, which didn't take very long. And there was something in the Handbook of North American Indians under the heading of Tzatane, which means in Athabascan, in their language, beaver people. Sometimes they're called Tzatane. But their name for themselves is DaneZaa, which means our people. And so I wrote this paper, and Kuhn thought it was okay. I think he gave me an A for the course. And a couple of years later, I was ready to graduate, and I wanted to go to grad school in anthropology. I applied to a number of departments, and Berkeley was one that I really wanted to go to. And they said, well, sorry, you don't have an anthropology degree. You only have one course with Kuhn and an introductory course. So if you want to come, we'll let you in, and all you have to do is the full program of an anthropology major, and then we'll consider you for entry into the MA program. So I went back to Kuhn and said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, go to Harvard, because he used to teach at Harvard. And I said, well, Swarthmore discourages students, except they're absolutely top elite students, from applying to Harvard because they have sort of a Swarthmore quota. Everybody at Swarthmore wants to go to Harvard for grad school, and they only take a very limited number of people, which no doubt is true in fields like history or English literature or some of the sciences. But anthropology, well, Kuhn said, I'll write you a good reference. A cat can look at a king, he said. So he wrote me a good reference, and to my utter astonishment, I was accepted into the PhD program directly, didn't have to go through the MA program. And although I had to take more or less the requisite courses, I didn't have to redo an undergraduate degree. I just had to get myself up to speed. And when I arrived there, I was such an innocent, everybody else, all of the other students, grad students, had been anthropology majors. Many of them were the children of professional anthropologists. I mean, they were really totally knowledgeable. But one thing I'd learned from my short amount of time with the DaneZaa was be a good listener. So I listened to their stories, and I learned a whole lot about what it means to be an anthropologist. I picked up as much as I possibly could of the lore of my fellow students, of anthropological lore. And they weren't sure how to assign me to an advisor. At first, I thought maybe I'd be in archaeology, so they sent me to Hallam Movius, who was a Upper Paleolithic archaeologist working at Vézère in France, as the renowned archaeologist. But after a while, I decided, no, I'm not really good at measuring things, and I'm not sure if I'm not good at digging, and I'm not that precise at laying out grid patterns. I think probably I'm not cut out to be that. So I went to them and I said, I think I want to be an ethnographer. That's the kind of anthropology I want to do. The anthropology department at the time was in the Peabody Museum. It was the anthropology and social relations were separate departments. So some of the social anthropology was in the SOC-RIL department, which is sociology and social anthropology, and archaeology, prehistory, and some ethnography were in Peabody Museum. So back to who am I going to have as an advisor? And practically the only person in the department who actually worked with Native American communities was Cora Dubois. And she was a student of Lowy, who was a student of Boas, and she had worked on the ghost dance in the 1930s or so, but she was currently working in India. She hadn't done any work with Native Americans for a very long time, but she said okay. She accepted me, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because she was a demon editor. She did not let me get away with sloppy writing, and she was very supportive and generous, just exactly what you'd want to have as an advisor. Most of the other students in the department fell into a pattern of junior professionalism, where you would ally yourself with the project that one of the senior anthropologists had ongoing as a long-term project. So, for instance, one of them was Evan Vogt, Voti everybody called him, who had worked with the Navajo but was now working in Chiapas. And he had a long-standing project of doing really comprehensive ethnography in Chiapas. So a lot of students would go and become Voti's accolades, that he would assign them a little subtopic of the ethnography in Chiapas, and they would go there and do what they were told to do. I'm not disparaging it, because they did. Some of them ended up being really important. Well, I was not interested in becoming a disciple of any of the projects, that any of the professors who had these long ongoing projects, because what had brought me there was the DaneZaa, and that's where I wanted to go for my fieldwork. I wanted to go back, and it was quite unusual, if you think about it, to have an unstudied North American Indian tribe all to yourself. I mean, it was just unheard of, really. But I didn't think about it that way. I thought about it as, these are really interesting people. I just want to learn more about them. So in 1964, I went back with my then wife, Antonia, now Antonia Mills, in a Volkswagen van, old Volkswagen van. And we arrived at the Prophet River Reserve, and some of the people remembered me. And one of the people there was an elder named Augustine Jumbie, and he kind of came up, and we offered him lunch, and he accepted. And pretty soon, people started. Nobody else on the reserve had a vehicle at that time. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have running water, and nobody had a vehicle. So I had a vehicle that actually could hold a lot of people. And so Jumbie, and then Johnny Schapisi, who I'd met before, the infamous Italian Boy Scout Vandal Schapisi, and Sam St Pierre. These were the important elders at the time. Quickly decided that I could be an asset. I was friendly, and I had a van, and I could drive people down to their summer camps and things like that. So we just quickly established a relationship like that, and particularly the St Pierre family pretty much adopted us, and eventually they. Well, I should talk about my research objectives. Initially, in order to get a small grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH, in the States, because I was still an American at the time, a small grant, I had written up a proposal to study something that social psychologists at the social relations department at Harvard thought was really important at the time, which was need for achievement, NACH. these days probably nobody's even heard of it, but it was a big deal in the Sauk-Rill department in Atch. And they were actually teaching courses to people from third world countries to improve their narrative skills, because the way it was coded, the way you could tell NH was that you would get people to tell stories, sometimes from just things like thematic apperception tests, and then you would code the stories for NH, and then so they kind of backward engineered that. It's a bizarre way of thinking if you think about it, but they backwards engineered that so that they would then take people from third world countries, academics from third world countries, and they would teach them to tell stories that could be coded for high NH. The theory being that if you code for high NH, nor need for achievement, you will be an achiever. Well, my idea was, because I was really interested in the economy of hunting and gathering cultures, and one of the things that the literature said was that societies that were low in accumulation would have high NH because they needed to keep working at it, like hunting and gathering cultures would be high in NH. And cultures like peasant societies, agricultural peasant societies, would be low in NH because there was very little that you could do. You were kind of stuck in a cultural rut. They didn't put it that way, but it was that sort of thinking. So I wrote up this proposal that I would administer thematic apperception tests using these cards with pictures of white people in very ambiguous situations, just no content, no context whatsoever. And then I would code the stories for NH, and that would then test the theory that low accumulation hunting cultures engendered a high degree of NH. Well, I started trying to get people to tell these stories, and they just didn't want to do it. It was just like pulling teeth to get them to sit down and look at these pictures of these strange white people with no context to what they were doing. And I remember one Billy St Pierre, who's my generation, it was a picture of a white guy holding a violin and kind of looking at it quizzically, not playing at it. And Billy's story was, "Must be he worried." That was the story. So, and others were equally full of content. So I realized, geez, if I start trying to code these people will come out as virtually autistic, just incapable of any kind of meaningful communication. And finally, Billy and some of the others said, we know lots of good Indian stories. Why don't you listen to some Indian stories? And that was it. I threw away the NH project. I threw away the proposal, and I started listening to Indian stories. And that's when I started a career of recording stories, recording songs, listening. And I think that has always been to me the essential key to being a good ethnographer. That is, be a good listener. And particularly when you're working with Native American cultures, the silences in between statements are part of the statements. Whereas in our Western culture, we tend to be very competitive about our discourse. As soon as there's a pause in what one person is saying, another person will jump in and hijack the conversation or turn it towards his or her way of continuing the story. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just the way it is. And I was able to overcome that, I hope, pretty well by simply listening to stories. Most of the stories I was listening to were in English, but also people then began to tell me stories in Beaver, DaneZaa, and I recorded these and then later worked with a translator to have these translated. The next winter, I came back, and I was able to I had a small grant from Harry Hawthorne. I discovered that Hawthorne had a grant to study Native people in Canada, in British Columbia. And he was very enthusiastic because the DaneZaa, the Beaver Indians, had never been studied after Goddard. And so it was a really small grant. I think it was, it's like $1,400 or something like that. But then, in 1965, $1,400 would go a long way. And I was able to buy, with a combination of my own resources or with my parents' help and with grant money, I was able to buy a brand new 1964 Ford four-wheel drive panel truck. And I had it outfitted with windows and a sort of bench along the side, so you could sleep in it, could turn it into a van, and it could hold virtually infinite number of people, and it could drive through the bush in four-wheel drive in the winter. And it was just the ideal. So when I came back with that, I was really a hit. That winter, I helped the whole community make firewood because the sources of firewood were a little bit farther away, and they were using horses and wagons to haul their firewood. So it was a lot easier to hook the wagon up to my four-wheel drive panel truck, and we'd go into the bush. And I had a power saw, and so did they. At this point, most people did have power saws. And we made their winter supply of firewood. And kind of in exchange, Sam St Pierre and his son, Billy, helped me build a cabin. And they knew how to do it. It was really different than the cabin my friends had made. They had built their cabin out of on the basis of a book called The Wilderness Cabin. I forget the name of the author. But one of the features of that cabin was that it had a high loft, which in that climate was, when it got 30, 40 below zero, was really, really cold, even if you had a fire inside. And their cabin was a classic trapping cabin, built up with logs, with rounded and coved joints. Didn't bother with fancy squared off joints or anything like that. And up to about the level of a height of a person, and then built up with purlins across, and we scrounged an old chimney from the local dump, and we scrounged some windows also from the dump, and I think I bought a roll of tar paper. So the whole cabin cost me maybe a couple of $100, and it was 10 by 10. We had an airtight heater in it. I had to buy an airtight heater, and it had a little wood stove as well, cooking stove. And it was cozy. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful house. We built an outhouse, and we were right next to the St Pierre house. And we often would go over there for meals. And we were essentially adopted by Sam and Jean St Pierre. So that was 1965, 66. We spent the whole winter there that time. And in just around New Year's time, Sam told me, we want to go down to the Blueberry Reserve and see Charlie Yahey. We think maybe he's dying. Well, I'd kind of heard that story before. Maybe Charlie Yahey's an important person. Maybe he's dying. You should go there. But it hadn't happened because we were building the cabin and building and getting firewood and all that. But finally, just before New Year's, just around New Year's, we piled into the van. Sam and Jean and Jumby and Tonya and I piled into the van. It was deep cold of winter. It was probably 40 below. It was really cold. And we drove down to the Blueberry Reserve, and there was Charlie Yahey. And we all stayed in this tiny little house. He had a really tiny cabin. At this point, it was not a log cabin. They'd just built reservation housing on the Blueberry Reserve. Nobody on Blueberry either had a vehicle. So I was the only vehicle. There was no electricity, of course. In order to start the van after a night, you had to take the battery inside the house to warm it. And then I had a lard pail, filled it with partially with diesel fuel, put some rags in the bottom, lit a fire in it, and then kept that fire burning under the oil pan of the car for a few hours. And then prayed a little bit and hooked up the battery, and sometimes it started. But I was 25 at the time, so, all those things didn't matter a lot. We dealt with it. But the most important thing that happened was, because this was right around, just after solstice, right after winter solstice, Charlie Yahey was singing almost constantly, singing and telling stories and talking with the elders that had come down from Prophet River. And I later learned that one of the things he talked about, one of his prophecies, was that if people did not sing and dance together at the time of winter solstice, the sun would simply keep going farther and farther and farther south until you would be in essentially an Arctic night, and it might never even come back. So people had to come together and sing and dance together. And the symbolism of that was that if you have a community that is in harmony, people dancing together and singing together, then you will be in harmony. Now, he didn't express it this way, but this is how I figured it out. Then you will be in harmony with the cosmos, with the animals, with the seasons, and the seasons will come back as they should. The animals will come back. The swans and the geese and the ducks will come back when the sun comes back. And things will continue in the normal cycle of events. I later learned that there is a culture hero named Saya, or sometimes called Yamadea, whose name means, Yamadea means something like he travels around the sky, or circles around the sky. And Saya simply means he's up in the heavens. And he's also found in, I discovered he's was found in Goddard's collection. So, stories about Yamadea are found in other Athabascan, northern Athabascan cultures. And he's a figure that is related to the turn of the seasons, among other things. So when people come and sing and dance together, they are essentially joining with Saya to bring about a turn of the seasons, the way things should be. I also learned later from Charlie Yahey that he said that when people have bad feelings with one another, when there's arguments and fights, which sometimes there are, I've actually written an article about this, that the community, the harmony of the community is disrupted. And if you don't do anything about it, when you die, you will become a dangerous ghost. Your spirit will not be able to go to heaven, and it will just lurk around, and it will be really dangerous. It will be hazardous for people that will try to catch the spirits of children, especially, because their spirits are very light, and they'll float up to heaven because they haven't had the time to accumulate many bad things. And the metaphor that all of those elders used was a word that sometimes they said called sense, and sometimes they called sins. So the sin part of it comes from their contact with Catholic priests, which they'd been contacted in 1854. But the sense comes from the fur trade, a metaphor from the fur trade, because when people would take out their winter supplies from the fur trader, it would be written down in a ledger book. So many traps, so many snares, so much powder, so much ball, etc. Tea and tobacco later on. This would all be written down in a ledger book. And sometimes they would then, when they came back with their furs, they would be given tokens that were called cents. And so the idea was that somewhere your sins or your cents, all the bad things you'd done, or the debts that you'd incurred, were written down somewhere. And if you danced with other people, there would be a multiplier effect, so that for every time you go around the circle with a group of people, a number of those cents would be removed, and you would eventually be contributing to restoring the harmony of the community. So it was a very complex system of thought, which I only learned gradually over the years, mostly from listening to Charlie Yahey, translations of Charlie Yahey's oratory, but also talking with other elders. And I found that the fundamental ideas are still around among the generation of, say, Charlie Yahey's grandchildren. This summer I recorded an extensive narrative by one of his grandchildren, Randa Yahey, who he had Charlie Yahey's teachings really well internalized. And it was so interesting because this was almost a 3-hour video interview I did this summer. Well, it wasn't an interview. It was just I started the camera and he talked. But he told me almost exactly the things that Charlie Yahey had told me, but he told it in English. So what he did was what I've called a performative translation. That is, he was thinking in Beaver. He'd learned the story from Beaver, but because he's relatively fluent in English, quite fluent in English, in Indian English, but good command of English, he told what I'd already heard in translation from Charlie Yahey in English. So that those metaphors, those teachings are still around among that generation. I suspect, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I suspect that now the generation that did not grow up speaking DaneZaa, Zage, Beaver language, and have been exposed to television and internet and high school and all of those things, that's probably foreign territory for them. They still dance. Young people are really interested in the dance, and they do know the importance of the dancing together as a way of expressing a sense of community. That part is really strong. But probably all of those metaphors from the fur trade just don't mean anything. It's so far in the past to them. Whereas Randa Yahey did grow up at the tag end of the fur trade era. So there's been a huge change just over the years since I've known the DaneZaa. When I first came there, as I said, there was no electricity, no running water, no vehicles. Now, everybody has a fancy new 4x4 crew cab. They've got, a lot of them are running independent businesses. They're contracting out sometimes to the oil and gas industry, sometimes to other industries. They're very adaptable Athabascan people. They're very good at figuring out what's going on in the contemporary cultural, economic scene, and then going with it, making something of it. The current chief at Doig, for instance, formerly ran a large trucking company. Really interesting. But he's also a very traditional guy. And one of the things that happened this summer, there were Doig cultural days. And he was supposed to show up the very first day and do a sort of greeting for the people who were coming to the cultural days. And he didn't show up, and one of the counselors gave the greeting. And I later learned that the reason that he didn't show up was that somebody else had been supposed to go out and get a moose to feed everybody and hadn't gotten one. And Trevor, who's in a wheelchair, said, I can go out and get a buffalo anytime I want. So he went out, got a buffalo, brought it back, and fed everybody. So, he's a chief who has run a large-scale business, owned multiple big heavy-duty trucks, is now the chief of the Dog River First Nation, but also feels his responsibility as a hunter and provider. So there's a huge amount of continuity as well as, change to adapt to changing circumstances. So I've told the story of how I became an anthropologist, and I think probably the most important thing that's been continuing was that of my teachers, the DaneZaa, particularly Charlie Yahey, has been one of the most important. But I certainly don't discount any of the professors that I had at Harvard. Cora Dubois was fantastic, as reining me in from prolix verbiage and too many commas or not enough commas, and she was really, really good at that. I should also mention Richard Lee, who's now a contemporary of mine. Well, he's a couple of years older, but anthropologist who's very well known for studying hunter-gatherer cultures, the Kuhn of the Kalahari. And he was a professor at Harvard. He was not a tenured professor, but I would say he was probably the most important intellectual influence that I had when I was at Harvard. I took a course with him. I guess it was a course on hunting and gathering cultures again. But he had a strong interest in, I wouldn't call it ecological determinism, but ecological contextualism, something like that. He was really felt it was important that you in order to understand the culture of a people, you have to understand the ecology, the environment in which they live, and their place in the ecology. So, cultural ecology, I guess, after Julian Stewart, you could call it that. So he was a tremendously important influence on me, and I really value the education that I got from him. And I think he influenced me a lot when it came to writing my thesis. When I got my first job offer, my only job offer other than being a busboy in a restaurant, was teaching anthropology at UBC. And probably the contact with Harry Hawthorne had been helpful, and Cyril Belshaw, who was the head of the department, hired me, and this was 1967. So I didn't have my degree yet, so it was but common in those days to hire somebody, especially if they came from some prestigious place like Harvard, and Mike Ames who was the later director of the Museum of Anthropology, had been a student of Cora Dubois at Harvard, so that probably didn't hurt. And I'd met him when I had come down from doing field work. I'd stayed with him and Eleanor Ames. So, I had contacts at UBC already. But I hadn't written a thesis yet. So that first year teaching at UBC, 1967, I spent the fall going out to my office and working on my thesis. And I had an office right next door to Wilson Duff, and we would exchange, just sort of greetings in the hall. But I also found out as a member of the department that Wilson Duff used to send these little messages around. This was way before internet or anything, but he would send these messages around to everybody in the department that were little philosophical gems of observation, and they were called PERSCOMs, for personal communications. So my contact with Wilson Duff was really important when I came to UBC just as a colleague. He was probably the most important colleague that I had at the time. So I spent that first time working up my courses, which I'd never done. The first teaching experience. I was 27 years old at the time, and working on my thesis, which ended up being called The Environmental Context of Beaver Indian Behavior. It sounded appropriately thesis-like. But a lot of it included stories. A lot of it was based on stories and genealogy. And one of the other most important things that I'd done in my field work was taking genealogical information, doing genealogical interviews from elders. And I'll talk later about how that became important many years later. The thesis was very strongly influenced, I guess, from what I'd learned from Richard Lee. So, as I said, it was the environmental context of Beaver Indian behavior translated into sort of more human terms. It's like how the culture and environment are related to one another, how the environment of the I call it the limitations and opportunities of a northern hunting environment were just critically important for understanding the culture of these people. And so the thesis used a lot of genealogical information and a lot of stories as evidence for the relationship between culture and environment. And when I finished the thesis, it was only about 250 pages long. I sent it in to Aunt Cora, and I think I might have gotten back a few comments and did a little revision and stuff, sent it back again. And a few months later, I got a Harvard PhD diploma in the mail. I didn't have to go back and defend it or anything. And subsequently, I took this Harvard PhD diploma, which is in Latin the big title, Universitas Harvardiana, and I pasted a picture of Charlie Yahey on it to indicate these were the sources of my education: Harvard, anthropology, and Charlie Yahey.